Jenny Salisa.
Mr Chair, I rise to take a call on the Education Amendment Bill number 2. This bill will amend the Education Act 1989, and I'd like to talk about section 380 and 382, which is about Education Council of New Zealand. Mr Chair, teachers have a very important and challenging task in Aotearoa. As a new Member of Parliament, I've spent the last few weeks visiting local schools, meeting teachers and talking with principals, and it really brings home just how challenging the task of teaching our children are for many of our low-income schools across New Zealand, especially for many of the schools in the electorate that I come from at Manukau East in South Auckland. Most of them, Mr Chair, are Decile 1A or Decile 1. I can tell you very clearly, Mr Chair, that this amendment bill does not support our teachers. This is not a bill that puts the interests of students or our nation's future first. The point of this policy should be to support our teachers to become highly functional and autonomous professionals at all levels in the education sector. But in order for this to happen, teachers must actively participate in the process and have their voices actually heard, rather than just being told by government appointees what to do. Teaching, Mr Chair, is one of our most important professions. Teachers spend thousands of hours a year with our children and young people. Teachers have an important role in building the future of Aotearoa New Zealand. We trust our teachers to be, after parents and families, perhaps the most influential people in our young people's lives. But this government won't even trust them to democratically elect their own representative members onto their own professional body. The knowledge, training, experience and expertise of teachers is to be silenced by this bill being proposed, squashed at the whims of this government. It is crucial, Mr Chair, that teachers and principals are democratically elected onto this new proposed Education Council of New Zealand. After all, Mr Chair, we live in a democracy. It is only through a democratic process where we will end up with a council that is representative of the profession that are in it, that they're supposed to represent, This is only fair, Mr Chair, particularly given the fact that teachers are expected to pay a registration fee to this body. It is only fair, if these fees are to be paid, that teachers should democratically be represented on it. As it stands, teachers will be compelled to pay the fees to a body which is handpicked and appointed by the Minister. Mr Chair, the same lack of concern for value and expertise and knowledge and for democracy is also apparent elsewhere in this bill, and I will speak about this a little bit later on, about wānanga and universities, if I have time. When the Education Amendment Bill number 2 was first introduced, the Minister of Education stated that the bill was the result of a 3-year conversation and widespread consultation which began in 2010. Mr Chair, according to the departmental report on this bill, 1,525 submissions were received. Of those, 1,032 submissions commented on the proposed establishments and functions of this new Education Council of New Zealand, which is section 382 of the bill, and the majority of those submissions were opposed to the amendments proposed on this bill. If this government had actually had a conversation about this bill, Education Amendment Bill number 2, we would be looking at a very different bill. What is really telling about just how much this government actually listens, cares or understands is the fact that although there has been indeed wide consultation, this isn't a conversation as most New Zealanders understand it. You might say this may have been more of a one-way conversation rather than a conversation as we, majority of us, would see it. A conversation involves listening, and it is pretty clear that this government did not listen to the over 1,500 New Zealanders who made submissions on this bill, because most of them were opposed to the establishment of Educans in this form. Mr Chair, it is not a conversation when almost everyone who makes a contribution opposes it and this government is still intent on implementing exactly what they had initially planned on implementing anyway. Mr. Chair.
Salisa.
It is not a conversation when this government progresses without actually addressing and taking into account most of the submissions of the over 1,500 submissions that have been received from teachers, from schools, from universities, from wānanga, from parents, from academics, from students and from the public in general. Mr. Chair, I will now turn to Section 6 of the bill as amended by Section 171. The governance changes proposed by Section 6 of the Education Amendment Bill No. 2 will diminish the voice and representation of staff and students on University and Wānanga Council. Staff and student representatives are key stakeholders at University and Wānanga, and they should be required participants in council decision-making. Removing staff and student representatives, Mr. Chair, will have a negative impact because both offer valuable skills, knowledge and experience to councils. In addition, students and staff have a democratic right to serve on tertiary education institution councils. Mr. Chair, many of my esteemed colleagues on both sides of this House cut their teeth as student politicians, students who represented other students, and some were on tertiary institution councils. The report from Education and Science Select Committee clearly shows that the changes proposed by the Education Amendment Bill No. 2 are strongly opposed by most of the submitters. In fact, of the 1,525 individual submissions and 298 oral submissions to the Select Committee, only five, Mr. Chair, supported these widely condemned reforms. We may hear about the 1%, but this is taking it to the next level at less than 1%. The changes proposed by this bill are universally opposed by the sector because the proposed changes are not based on any evidence, any real arguments, and the entire sector says they will have negative consequences. One of these negative consequences, Mr. Chair, includes a reduction in academic freedom and autonomy. Increasing the number and proportion of influence of government to up to 40% as appointed at the choice or the whim of the minister will indeed give politicians an unfair and undue influence on Aotearoa's wānanga and universities. Universities have a role of being the critic and conscience of our society. Our tertiary education institutions are supposed to be free from political pressure. Mr. Chair, the changes proposed by Education Amendment Bill No. 2 will undermine the independence of our wānanga and universities. There is a need for this House to focus on raising the quality of education in Aotearoa, and we can begin this, Mr. Chair, by acknowledging, by affirming and by supporting our teachers and our academics for the crucial role that teachers and academic profession have in setting and maintaining the standards for the profession. This bill does not do this. Mr. Chair, Labor strongly opposes the Education Amendment Bill No. 2. Kia ora tātou katoa. Mr. Chair.